Jack Reacher? That's just a movie, kid. The teacher's voice dripped with sarcasm as the class erupted in laughter. Malik's face burned, his fists clenched tight, but he stayed silent. He'd heard the whispers all week, seen the smirks, until the classroom door creaked open. Every head turned, and standing in the doorway, calm, unshaken, was the man they all said didn't exist. Jack Reacher. What happened next silenced the entire school. Welcome to Jack Reacher Heroics. Let's uncover what really happened. The classroom buzzed with the low murmur of students settling into their seats. In the back row, Malik sat with a quiet confidence that was sometimes mistaken for shyness. He shifted in his seat, his dark eyes scanning the room. But his attention never wavered from the front, where Mr. Edwards, the history teacher, was preparing to begin the lesson. "All right, class, let's settle down," Mr. Edwards said with a tone that carried the weight of authority. "Today, we're diving into the American heroes who shaped our history." He smiled as he gestured to the American flag hanging above the chalkboard. "Can anyone name a hero who made an impact?" A few hands shot up, eager to share their answers. George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Rosa Parks. The usual names that made their way into any classroom discussion. But Malik's hand stayed down. He had heard these names before, and while they were important, they didn't resonate with him the way some other names did. "Malik?" Mr. Edwards asked, catching his eye. Malik hesitated for a brief moment, then stood up, his voice calm but sure. "My dad is Jack Reacher." The room fell into an awkward silence. Malik's statement hung in the air like an uninvited guest. He said it casually, almost as if it were a fact as ordinary as his name. But to the rest of the class, it was anything but ordinary. Mr. Edwards chuckled softly, trying to mask the amusement that was creeping into his expression. "Jack Reacher? You mean the fictional character, right?" Malik nodded, unfazed. "Yes, the same one. He's my dad." The class erupted into laughter, a few students looking at each other, unsure whether to believe him or not. Mr. Edwards, still smiling, shook his head. "Well, that's a new one. I've heard some wild stories, but this one takes the cake." He turned to the rest of the class, who were now whispering among themselves, their laughter rising. "Let's get back to our lesson, shall we?" Malik sat back down, his expression unreadable, while the laughter continued to echo in his ears. What they didn't know was that his claim was far from a joke. But for now, it didn't matter. The laughter died down eventually, but the whispers persisted long after the bell rang, signaling the end of the school day. Malik kept his head down as he gathered his things, trying to ignore the stares from his classmates. They didn't believe him. How could they? To them, Jack Reacher was a character from a best-selling series of books and movies, a towering figure of action and toughness. A man who could never be real, let alone be someone's father. As Malik stepped out of the classroom, he felt the weight of their doubts pressing on him. Even Mr. Edwards, who had tried to mask his disbelief with humor, had that look in his eyes, the one that said he thought Malik was just another kid looking for attention. But Malik wasn't like the others. He didn't need to exaggerate his life for a laugh. His life was extraordinary. He walked down the hallway, his thoughts swirling. He had been raised by a man who rarely spoke of himself, a man whose life was a series of unpredictable turns, and yet one that always ended with righting the wrongs of the world. To say Jack Reacher was a hero was an understatement. But how could he explain that to people who only saw the surface? He couldn't, and yet part of him wanted to. He wanted to show them the quiet strength his father possessed, the patience, the discipline, the way he could turn a violent situation into nothing more than a series of calm, controlled decisions. Malik had grown up watching this, learning without needing to be taught. But no one would ever see that side of Reacher, not in the world of flashy stories and quick judgments. "Malik!" A voice called from behind him. He turned to see his friend, Jamal, hurrying to catch up. "Don't worry about them," Jamal said, a sympathetic grin on his face. "People don't get it. You don't have to prove anything to them." Malik gave a small smile, but inside, a part of him wondered if Jamal was right. Would anyone ever believe him? Or would his claim remain just another misunderstood story in a world too eager to laugh it off? The next day at school, the whispers had grown louder. Malik could feel the eyes of his classmates on him, as he walked through the hallways. It wasn't just curiosity now. It was something sharper, a mix of mockery and disbelief. It wasn't enough to let him be. He could hear the low laughter, the pointed stares, the hushed conversations. It was as if they had all decided that what he had said couldn't possibly be true, and so, in their minds, it had to be a joke. During lunch, Malik found a quiet corner in the cafeteria, trying to escape the noise. He'd barely unwrapped his sandwich when he heard the voice. It was unmistakable, the sharp, mocking tone of Kyle, one of the more popular kids in his grade. "Hey, Malik," Kyle called from across the room, his friends snickering behind him. "Didn't know Jack Reacher's kid was sitting with us today." Malik froze, his hand hovering over the sandwich. The laughter that followed was loud, deliberate, and it cut through the air like a knife. Malik's cheeks burned, but he didn't rise to the bait. He kept his head down, focusing on the table in front of him, hoping that if he ignored them long enough, they'd move on. But Kyle wasn't done. He swaggered over to Malik's table, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Hey, Malik," he said, leaning in close. "Why don't you tell us what it's like to have a dad who can take out a whole army single-handedly?" His friends laughed again, louder this time. Malik gripped his sandwich tightly, his fingers turning white. The words stung more than he let on. He had never been one to back down from a challenge. But this wasn't a fight he could win with words alone. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm building inside him. "Leave me alone, Kyle," he muttered, his voice steady but quiet. Kyle smirked, stepping back. "Sure thing, Reacher's kid," he said with another mock salute. "Keep dreaming." The laughter continued as Malik sat in silence, the weight of their doubt pressing on him. He wasn't just being laughed at. They were making him the joke. And it hurt more than he ever expected. That evening, Malik sat alone in his room, staring out the window as the sun dipped below the horizon. The laughter from school still echoed in his mind. Kyle's voice, his friends' jeers, it was all too much. He had always known there would be people who doubted him, but hearing it in such a public way felt different. The door creaked open, pulling him from his thoughts. He turned to see his father standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable but calm. Jack Reacher didn't often say much, but when he did, it was always with purpose. "Everything okay?" Jack asked, his voice low but firm. Malik hesitated before nodding. He didn't want to burden his father with his troubles, especially not when Jack had his own things to focus on. But the weight of the day's ridicule was too much to keep inside. "It's just," Malik started, his voice trailing off. He didn't know how to explain it. "They think I'm lying. They think I'm making it all up." Jack stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. He sat down on the edge of the bed, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. "You told them the truth," Jack said, his voice steady. "What matters is that you know it. You don't need anyone else's approval to believe what's real." Malik looked up at him, searching his father's face for some kind of reassurance. "But what if they never believe me?" Jack leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "Then you let your actions speak louder than your words. You show them who you are, what you stand for. People will doubt always, but what they can't deny is what you do, how you live." Malik felt a weight lift off his chest as he met his father's eyes. In that moment, he understood. His father wasn't just talking about defending himself in a fight. It was about proving his worth through integrity, resilience, and the quiet strength that ran through his blood. "Promise me you'll never stop being you," Jack added. Malik nodded, the knot in his stomach loosening. "I promise." The next day at school, Malik walked through the halls with a new sense of resolve. The whispers still followed him, but they no longer bothered him as much. Kyle's taunts had lost their sting, replaced by something stronger, his father's words. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. His confidence wasn't built on making people believe his story. It was built on the strength of knowing who he was and where he came from. In class, Mr. Edwards droned on about historical figures, but Malik's mind was elsewhere. He wasn't thinking about the lesson. He was thinking about his dad, about the way he had always carried himself with calm authority. He had never needed to boast or brag, and that was the lesson Malik was starting to understand. True confidence came from within, not from convincing others. As the bell rang for lunch, Malik gathered his things and headed to the cafeteria. He was halfway to his usual table when he saw Kyle with his group of friends standing near the door, talking in loud, exaggerated voices. Kyle saw Malik and shot him a smirk, but this time Malik didn't flinch. He simply walked past, not a word or glance given. A few of Kyle's friends snickered, but Malik didn't care. They were nothing but noise. Malik's focus was on the quiet confidence that had settled in his chest, a confidence that didn't require applause or validation. It wasn't arrogance. It was a deep, unshakable knowledge that he didn't need to justify himself. He didn't need to explain his father's role in his life. His actions, his quiet strength would say enough. He sat down at the lunch table, Jamal already there, his eyes wide as he looked Malik over. "You okay?" Jamal asked, sensing the change in his friend. Malik nodded, a small, genuine smile pulling at his lips. "Yeah, I'm good. Really good." And for the first time in a long while, Malik felt it. He was finally comfortable in his own skin. The doubts of others could linger all they wanted, but they couldn't touch the peace that was starting to settle deep inside him. The next week, Mr. Edwards continued to make subtle remarks, almost as if testing the limits of Malik's patience. The other students caught on, and some of them joined in, always with a smirk or a side eye whenever Malik spoke. It was the kind of low-level mocking that wore a person down without ever seeming overt. They thought Malik was just a kid trying to gain attention. Mr. Edwards, in particular, seemed determined to remind him that he was nothing special. One afternoon, Malik sat in the back of the class, focusing on the assignment at hand. The lesson was about the heroes of American history, but Malik's mind kept wandering. He could hear Mr. Edwards' voice droning on about famous figures, but the tone was different today. The mockery was now more pronounced. "And of course," Mr. Edwards said, his eyes flicking toward Malik, "we all know about the larger-than-life figures, like George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. But of course, it's not as if you'd find someone like, say, Jack Reacher, running around in our history books. No, that's a character for Hollywood, not real life." He let the words hang in the air like a challenge, as if daring Malik to react. The room fell silent for a moment, the class waiting for Malik to say something. Malik stayed still, his gaze steady, not looking at Mr. Edwards, but at the paper in front of him. He could feel his classmates' eyes on him, waiting for a reaction. They all knew it was aimed at him, but this time, he wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. Mr. Edwards, sensing the tension, smiled, thinking he'd scored a point. "You know, it's important to separate fiction from reality," he added, his voice still light. "We wouldn't want any of us thinking we're in the movies, right?" The class laughed, but Malik didn't. He kept his head down, his hand gripping the pencil tightly. He had promised his father not to engage in the noise. Yet, as the teacher continued his lesson, Malik realized it wasn't about changing their minds. It was about remaining unshaken, a quiet force in a world full of distractions. The teacher may have dismissed him, but Malik would prove, in time, that no dismissal could erase the truth of who he was. The days following Mr. Edwards' dismissal were the hardest for Malik. Each step through the hallways felt like a gauntlet. His classmates, even those who had once been friendly, had started to distance themselves. Their laughter, quiet first, now followed him everywhere. It wasn't just Kyle anymore, it was everyone. Whispers became louder, more frequent, like a chorus of doubt that never stopped. By the time the lunch bell rang, Malik had already heard his name spoken more times than he could count, but never in kindness. He walked through the cafeteria doors, his heart heavy, when he noticed the group near the front of the room, laughing. "Hey, look," one of the girls said, pointing toward him. "It's Jack Reacher's son. What's next? Gonna tell us your mom's Wonder Woman." Malik didn't stop. He kept walking, ignoring the snickers and the stares. He could feel their eyes on him, but he refused to let them see him flinch. He was used to it now, but the hurt still lingered, a sharp ache in his chest every time someone laughed at him. He found his usual seat next to Jamal, who was waiting with a concerned expression. "Man, you good?" Jamal asked softly, as if afraid to draw attention to the question. Malik nodded, though the tightness in his throat made it hard to speak. "Yeah, I'm fine." Jamal didn't seem convinced, but he didn't press it. Instead, he changed the subject, as if to shield Malik from the relentless tide of ridicule. Yet, even as Jamal spoke about the latest video game release, Malik's mind drifted. The echoes of disbelief, the taunts, the constant undercurrent of mockery. It was becoming harder to tune out. Each time someone made a joke about his dad, each laugh that echoed off the walls of the school, Malik felt the weight of their doubt pressed down on him. They didn't understand. They wouldn't. Not until they saw it for themselves. And though the thought filled him with a quiet resolve, it also made him question just how long he could keep standing strong against the tide. The more Malik tried to ignore the taunts, the more they seemed to follow him. The whispers in the hallways grew sharper, more pointed. It was as if everyone in the school had agreed to make his life a joke. Even Jamal, who had always had his back, couldn't always shield him from the growing weight of their disbelief. But no matter how loud the voices around him became, Malik kept his head high. His father's absence was a heavy silence, one that Malik carried with him everywhere. Jack Reacher had never been a constant presence in his life, but that didn't mean his shadow didn't loom over everything. He never talked about what his father did or how he lived. Jack Reacher wasn't the type of man who shared details of his life, and Malik respected that. But the more people doubted him, the more he understood just how little they knew about the quiet force that was Jack Reacher. Reacher didn't need to be in the spotlight. He never had. Malik had seen the quiet strength his father carried, the way he moved through life with an unshakable confidence, never boasting about his accomplishments. It wasn't about what others thought. It was about doing what needed to be done without any fanfare. Jack Reacher's world didn't require acknowledgement from the masses. It was an isolated, hard world of truth and justice, a world where actions spoke louder than words. That shadow, Malik realized, wasn't something that could be seen by the school. It wasn't the visible presence of his father's towering figure. It was something far more subtle, woven into every moment Malik spent trying to live up to a legacy that no one believed was his to claim. He didn't need to fight back with words, because he had something stronger, the calm persistence of someone who knew exactly who he was. Every day, Malik carried that shadow with him, and as the mocking grew louder, he began to understand something. The weight of his father's absence was not a curse, but a blessing. Reacher had shown him that the best way to stand strong in a world full of doubt was simply to be silent, steady, and unyielding. And one day, the truth would speak for itself. It was late in the afternoon when Malik found himself at the basketball courts, his sneakers scuffing against the asphalt. The day had been another round of sneers and whispered jokes, but now, in this small corner of the world, there was at least one place where he could lose himself, where the noise faded away, replaced by the steady rhythm of dribbling and the occasional shout of a friend calling for a pass. Jamal jogged up to him, a grin on his face despite the lingering tension. "Ready to show these guys how it's done?" he asked, bouncing the basketball in his hand. Malik nodded, stretching his legs out and glancing over at the other players. It wasn't much, a few friends, some random kids from the neighborhood, but it was enough. On this court, no one cared about the rumors. No one cared about who your dad was or what kind of life you lived. Here, it was all about the game, the shot, the pass, the action. "Got your back. Always," Jamal said as they took their positions, moving into the game with an easy fluidity born from years of playing together. It wasn't about competing for anything other than the sheer joy of playing. But in that moment, surrounded by his friends and the familiar bounce of the ball, Malik felt a shift. For once, the doubts didn't weigh him down. As the game began, Malik found himself sinking into the rhythm, the game pulling him further from the classroom's mockery. He moved fast, his feet finding their mark with precision, his eyes scanning for the next opening. Jamal was quick to follow his lead, and they made a near-perfect play. Malik passed the ball, Jamal faked left, then sprinted right, landing the ball cleanly in the basket. The guys on the court cheered, the sound of their voices ringing in the cool air. For a moment, it wasn't about Malik being Jack Reacher's son. It was about being one of them. The boys of steel and grit, no grand titles or stories, just the sheer determination to play hard, to give everything, and to win with quiet confidence. In that moment, Malik knew something. He didn't need to prove himself to anyone outside this circle. Here, he was enough. The next day, as Malik walked into the school, he could feel the tension in the air. His classmates were still talking about him, but now, it wasn't just idle gossip. The whispers had turned into something more pointed. Kyle, the ringleader, had somehow decided that Malik's claim about Jack Reacher was his personal challenge. He had spent the entire morning telling everyone that he was going to prove Malik wrong. "Hey, Malik." Kyle's voice cut through the hallway as he approached, his smirk wide and knowing. "Still claiming your dad is some kind of hero? How about we settle this? You up for a little bet?" Malik didn't respond immediately. He had known this was coming. Kyle was one of those guys who couldn't let something go, and now he was turning it into a spectacle. Malik stopped in his tracks, turned to face Kyle, and crossed his arms. "A bet?" Malik asked, his voice level, but there was an edge to it that caught the attention of a few nearby students. "Yeah," Kyle said, stepping closer. "I'll bet you a week's worth of lunch that your dad isn't who you say he is. I'll even throw in a few extra bucks if you can prove me wrong. But I know you can't. Your dad's just a story, Malik. Everyone knows that." A murmur rippled through the crowd of students who had gathered around, eager to see how Malik would react. Kyle's challenge hung in the air, a test of both Malik's integrity and his patience. Malik's gaze didn't falter. He didn't need to rise to the bait or match Kyle's arrogance. He had learned long ago that actions spoke louder than words. "You want proof," Malik said quietly, his voice steady. "Then you'll get it when the time is right. But not today." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Kyle's challenge unanswered. Behind him, the crowd fell into a stunned silence, but Malik didn't care. He wasn't going to play by Kyle's rules. He knew that in the end, truth would find its way to the surface, whether Kyle believed it or not. The days that followed Kyle's challenge seemed to drag on endlessly. Malik went through the motions of school, but everything felt like it was on pause. His classmates continued to mock him, some of them openly asking when his hero dad was going to show up to prove them all wrong. The taunts came with increasing frequency, each one chipping away at Malik's patience. But he didn't rise to any of it. His resolve, the quiet confidence he had learned from his father, held firm. One afternoon, as Malik was leaving the school building, the air heavy with the buzz of the day's final bell, he felt it, a shift in the atmosphere. He turned a corner by the front doors, and there, standing against the school's brick wall, was a figure. It wasn't just anyone. Malik's pulse quickened as his eyes locked on the man who stood so still, so calm in the midst of the chaos. Jack Reacher. He was hard to miss, even in the distance, his tall frame, his posture like he belonged in every room he entered. But it wasn't the way he looked that made Malik's heart race. It was the presence that Reacher carried. There was something about him, an aura of quiet power that seemed to command attention without asking for it. Malik froze, unsure of how to react. The challenge had been made, the whispers had spread, and now here was the man who had always been an unseen part of his life, standing right in front of him. Reacher didn't move at first, didn't speak, but Malik could feel his father's eyes on him, steady and unblinking. The world around him seemed to fade away, the noise of the students, the jeers, the doubt. There was only Reacher, waiting, his gaze never leaving Malik's. Without a word, Malik stepped forward, his heart steady. It didn't matter what anyone else thought anymore. This was his moment, and his father's arrival was the proof he never needed to explain. As Malik approached, Reacher gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and in that moment, Malik knew the truth. His father's presence, unseen until now, spoke volumes, louder than any challenge or mocking laughter ever could. The bell rang, signaling the end of school, but Malik didn't rush to the exit. He moved slowly, deliberately, as his father remained at the edge of the parking lot, leaning against the wall like a man who was comfortable in the silence. Malik's heart pounded in his chest, but this time it wasn't out of anxiety. It was from something deeper, something familiar. He had always known his father was capable of great things, but seeing him in person, standing here now, made everything he'd heard, everything he'd grown up with, suddenly make sense. As he approached, Malik found the courage to speak. "You didn't have to come, Dad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, though his heart was loud with questions. "Why now?" "Jack Reacher," didn't immediately respond. Instead, he looked at his son for a long moment, his face unreadable. Finally, he straightened up and pushed himself off the wall, his eyes scanning the school, the same focused look he had when he was studying his surroundings. "I didn't come because they don't believe you," Reacher said quietly. "I came because you needed to know that you don't need anyone's belief. Not to be who you are." Malik was silent for a moment, processing the weight of his father's words. "They think I'm lying," Malik replied, his voice low. "They think I'm just making this up, that you're some kind of joke." Reacher's expression softened, just slightly, before he gave a single nod. "That's the thing with stories, Malik. People always want to make sense of them. But the truth behind the stories? That's something they'll never see unless they're looking for it." Malik glanced around, feeling the weight of the eyes watching him from the school windows, the whispers that had followed him since the moment he spoke his father's name. But now, with his dad standing next to him, none of it mattered. "You're not a joke, Dad," Malik said, his voice steady. "And neither am I." Reacher placed a hand on his shoulder, a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. "No, you're not." The following day, Malik walked through the hallways of his school with an unfamiliar sense of quiet confidence. His father's presence was still fresh in his mind, but it was more than just his father standing there yesterday. It was the way Jack Reacher had carried himself, calm, focused, untouchable. In his presence, the world seemed to align, and for the first time, Malik felt the truth of his words echoing louder than the ridicule. But that didn't stop the whispers. As soon as Malik entered the hallway, he could feel the eyes on him. He could hear the muffled voices behind him, the ones that turned into hushed laughs as he passed by. The mocking hadn't stopped. It was worse now. The disbelief had shifted into something sharper, something more bitter. It was as if the presence of Jack Reacher was a challenge no one had expected, a disruption they didn't know how to process. "Did you see that?" A voice said from behind him, followed by a giggle. Reacher actually showed up. "That kid wasn't lying, huh?" Malik didn't turn around, but he knew who it was. Kyle's voice was unmistakable, and even though Malik wasn't facing him, he could feel the boy's eyes burning into his back. "You think he's actually Jack Reacher's son?" Another voice asked, and Malik could almost picture the skeptical expression on their face. "No way. He's just some kid trying to get attention." Reacher's not the type to walk into a school and talk to a kid like that. The whispers continued, growing louder, but Malik's steps didn't falter. He kept walking, his gaze forward as he approached his next class. He had heard it all before, but now it didn't affect him the way it once did. He didn't need their approval, their acceptance. He knew who he was. By the time he reached the door to his classroom, Malik realized something important. The whispers would always be there, but so would his father's shadow. And as long as that shadow was with him, the truth didn't need to be spoken aloud. It would resonate through every quiet step he took, every unshakable moment of confidence. Mr. Edwards had always been a man of certainty. He had a sharp wit, a quick mind, and a way of asserting his authority in the classroom that made students toe the line. But as the days passed since the incident with Malik, a quiet doubt began to creep into his thoughts. He had laughed it off at first, treating Malik's claim about his father as a harmless bit of teenage fantasy. After all, Jack Reacher wasn't a real person. He was a fictional character, a product of books and movies. But the more Mr. Edwards thought about it, the more uncomfortable he became. Jack Reacher wasn't just a character to Malik. He was family. And Malik's calm, unwavering belief in that fact had thrown Mr. Edwards' world off balance. The boy's conviction had been so real, so sincere, that it started to gnaw at him, chipping away at the walls of his doubt. It wasn't just Malik either. The other students had begun to notice, too. Some had started to talk about it, whispering in the halls, questioning whether there might be more to the story than they'd initially thought. Kyle, who had been one of the loudest mockers, now seemed quieter, more reserved whenever he mentioned Malik. Even some of the girls, who had initially laughed at the idea, were beginning to wonder if there might be a kernel of truth to Malik's words. In the classroom, Mr. Edwards found himself looking at Malik differently. The boy wasn't backing down. He wasn't reacting to the ridicule. And as much as Mr. Edwards tried to ignore it, he couldn't shake the thought that perhaps he had been too quick to dismiss Malik's claim. Maybe there was something more going on here, something that he didn't fully understand. The next time he looked over at Malik, sitting quietly in his seat with his gaze fixed ahead, Mr. Edwards found himself hesitating. Maybe, just maybe, the truth was more complicated than he had originally believed. It was a Thursday afternoon when the unexpected visitor arrived. Malik was sitting in his usual spot at lunch, absent-mindedly picking at his sandwich, when he heard a commotion near the school entrance. The usual buzz of students was interrupted by a few hushed voices, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, and confident. Malik's gaze flickered to the doors, and his stomach clenched. "Who is that?" Jamal whispered, leaning forward as a tall, broad figure stepped through the doors. The crowd seemed to part instinctively, almost as if they knew who it was before they saw him. The man's presence was undeniable. His stride was measured, purposeful, and though he didn't look around, his eyes scanned everything around him, taking it all in with an effortless ease. Malik's heart skipped a beat when he realized who it was. Standing at the entrance of the cafeteria, wearing a dark jacket and an expression that was calm but intense, was Jack Reacher. The room went silent. Students froze, their eyes wide, their conversations stopping mid-sentence. Even the lunchroom staff looked up from their duties in disbelief. Reacher was out of place, but in a way that made his presence feel undeniable, like he belonged there in a way no one else did. Malik stood up, his legs feeling shaky for a moment, but his feet carried him toward his father, as if instinctively. As he moved through the crowd, the whispers grew louder, and for a brief moment, he felt a wave of uncertainty. But when he reached his father, everything else faded. Jack Reacher gave him a single nod, his eyes steady as always. The silence stretched out for a few long seconds before a voice broke through. "Is that really him?" someone whispered. "Is that actually Jack Reacher?" Malik could see Kyle at the back of the room, his mouth slightly agape, unable to form the words. The doubts were now gone, replaced by something deeper: respect, fear, and disbelief. Jack Reacher looked at his son one last time, then turned to face the room full of students, his voice as quiet as ever. "I'm here for my son," he said simply, his tone unshaken. "And I'm leaving now. Don't make this more complicated than it needs to be." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving behind a room full of people who would never forget what they had just witnessed. The next day, Mr. Edwards entered the classroom with his usual routine, but the air felt different. There was a low hum of excitement as the students took their seats, their eyes darting toward the door every few seconds. Word had spread quickly about the visit from Jack Reacher, and now, the curiosity was palpable. Even the most skeptical students were eager to see what would happen next. As the bell rang and the class settled, Mr. Edwards cleared his throat, but before he could speak, the door opened again. Everyone went silent. Malik looked up in surprise as his father stepped into the room, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. The room seemed to freeze, every eye on the man who had walked in without announcement, without ceremony. Reacher stood there for a moment, his gaze sweeping the room, meeting Mr. Edwards' eyes with a steady, unflinching look. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Jack Reacher said, his voice calm, but with an undertone that carried weight. He didn't wait for permission. Instead, he simply walked into the classroom, his presence commanding the space as he made his way toward the front. Malik's classmates sat frozen, unable to speak. Kyle's mouth hung open, his expression one of disbelief. Reacher didn't acknowledge anyone else. His focus was solely on Malik, who sat wide-eyed in his seat, trying to process the fact that his father was standing in front of his classmates in the middle of his school day. Mr. Edwards cleared his throat again, his expression somewhere between stunned and cautious. "Mr. Reacher, I wasn't expecting." "Neither was I," Jack interrupted, his voice even, but there was no hint of apology in his words. "I didn't come here to cause trouble, but to set things straight." The tension in the room was thick, but Jack didn't seem to notice. His focus remained on Malik, and his quiet strength filled the room, speaking louder than any words could. "I know my son doesn't need to prove anything to anyone," Reacher continued, his gaze steady. But I'm here to let you all know that the truth has a way of showing itself, no matter how much you try to deny it. With that, he turned to leave, leaving behind a room full of stunned students and a teacher who had no words left. The moment Jack Reacher stepped out of the classroom, the door clicking shut behind him, a profound silence settled over the room. For a few beats, no one moved. It was as if the entire class had been struck by some kind of collective disbelief, caught in a suspended moment that felt heavier than the rest of the school year combined. Malik's gaze stayed fixed on the door, his heart still pounding from the surreal encounter. He had watched his father enter the room, heard the calm authority in his voice, and seen the disbelief in the eyes of his classmates. But as the silence stretched on, he realized something. This wasn't about the show of power or the spectacle of having Jack Reacher in their midst. It was about his father standing tall, without saying a word more than necessary. "Okay, class," Mr. Edwards finally said, breaking the stillness, though his voice was tight. Let's try to focus here. What just happened?" The rest of the students were still processing, whispering to one another, trying to make sense of what had just unfolded. Kyle, the loudest of the mockers, sat with his mouth slightly agape, unable to form words. The rest of the class glanced at Malik, and though they didn't know what to say, it was clear they weren't laughing anymore. Malik sat back in his chair, his posture relaxed despite the storm of emotions inside him. He hadn't needed his father to do this. But the way Reacher had stood in that room, unbothered by the stares, unaffected by the doubts, it was exactly how Malik had learned to be. Calm, unshaken. His father had always shown him that true strength didn't come from boasting or proving a point. It came from the ability to stand tall, no matter what others thought. The classroom buzzed with low murmurs, but for Malik, the noise faded into the background. He knew that no amount of ridicule or doubt could ever touch him again. His father had proven that without a single punch, without raising his voice, Jack Reacher had stood tall, and in doing so, had erased all the mockery. The days after Jack Reacher's unexpected visit felt like a slow unraveling of the tension that had built up over weeks of ridicule. The mockery didn't disappear entirely, but shifted. The whispers in the hallways, the sideways glances, the occasional snickers, they weren't as sharp anymore. It was as if the air had cleared, and everyone knew that something had changed, but no one was quite sure what it was. Malik walked through the school with a quiet confidence he hadn't known he possessed. His classmates no longer saw him as the kid with an outlandish claim. He was the son of the man who had shown up, uninvited, and turned the whole school on its head. But it wasn't the visit that had changed things. It was the proof in the presence. Jack Reacher didn't need to say much. His presence alone had been enough to shift everything. In class, Mr. Edwards seemed different. The way he looked at Malik had changed. Less mocking, more thoughtful. But there was something else too, something more uncertain in his eyes. Malik could tell that the teacher had been forced to reassess what he had once dismissed as a ridiculous claim. He wasn't sure if Mr. Edwards would ever fully accept the truth, but it didn't matter. The teacher had seen the undeniable evidence. Jack Reacher wasn't just a name in a book, a character on a screen. He was a real presence, someone who could not be ignored. After class, Malik caught Jamal's eye as he walked out the door, his mind still swirling with the reality of his father's visit. "You good?" Jamal asked, falling into step beside him. Malik nodded, his expression calm, but his thoughts were anything but. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I'm good. It's just weird, you know?" Jamal gave him a look of understanding. "You don't need to prove anything to anyone. Your dad already did that." Malik didn't need to say anything more. The truth was clear. No one could deny it now. The proof wasn't in words or in some grand display. It was in the quiet, unwavering certainty that stood in front of them that day. The truth had always been there, hidden in plain sight. And now, they had all seen it for themselves. Mr. Edwards had always prided himself on his ability to control the classroom, to command respect through knowledge and wit. But after Jack Reacher's visit, something in the air had shifted. The students no longer viewed him as the authority they once did. They didn't look to him for guidance or wisdom the same way. No, now all their eyes were on Malik, and Malik's eyes were on his father. The change was subtle At first, a quiet acknowledgement in the way the students interacted. They no longer laughed at Malik's claims, no longer rolled their eyes when he spoke about his father. Instead, there was an undercurrent of curiosity, of respect that hadn't been there before. Mr. Edwards noticed it first when he tried to steer the class back to the lesson. He could feel the students' attention drifting, their minds not on the material he was teaching, but on the recent events. Some of them weren't even pretending to listen anymore. Their focus was now entirely on Malik, their thoughts consumed with the undeniable truth they had witnessed firsthand. The final blow came when he called on Malik during a discussion. Mr. Edwards had hoped to regain control, to demonstrate that things were back to normal, but when he asked Malik a question, the class shifted. Every eye in the room was on Malik, waiting for the answer. And when Malik responded, quiet, sure, calm, there was an unspoken understanding in the room that this wasn't just another classroom moment. This was different. Mr. Edwards, trying to recover, glanced around the room for support, but the students weren't with him. They weren't looking to him for approval anymore. They had seen what Malik had seen, the man who had entered their school, unaffected by the skepticism, and proven his worth without uttering a single word of defense. The teacher's face flushed with a deep, uncomfortable heat. His words faltered, and the room seemed to shrink around him. Malik had always been right, and now everyone knew it. The teacher wasn't the authority anymore. The truth had become its own lesson, and Mr. Edwards was left to reckon with his own humiliation. The following week, Mr. Edwards did something no one had expected. He wasn't one to apologize, at least not in the way most people would understand, but the shift in his behavior was undeniable. For the first time since the start of the semester, he didn't open with a joke or a comment that undermined Malik's presence in the class. Instead, he simply stood at the front of the room, his posture a little straighter, his voice more measured. As the bell rang and the class settled, Mr. Edwards took a deep breath. "All right, class," he began, his tone unexpectedly serious. "We're going to discuss something different today. A lesson in integrity." Malik, who had expected another round of passive-aggressive comments, sat up straight, unsure of what was coming. The other students exchanged curious glances. The whole room seemed to be leaning in, waiting for Mr. Edwards to explain himself. Integrity, Mr. Edwards continued, his gaze sweeping across the room, is about doing what's right even when no one is watching. It's about holding yourself to a standard that doesn't bend with the crowd, no matter how loud they get. And most importantly, it's about having the courage to stand by your truth, even when others try to tear it down. Malik's heart skipped a beat. Mr. Edwards' words hung in the air like a challenge. The room had gone silent, the usual hum of teenage chatter replaced by the weight of what was being said. Mr. Edwards didn't look at Malik directly, but it was clear that his words were for him. The teacher paused, allowing the lesson to sink in. "Sometimes," Mr. Edwards continued, "we get caught up in the noise around us, in the distractions that make us doubt what we know to be true. But real integrity comes when you can stand firm, no matter what the world says." For the first time, Malik didn't feel the need to respond. The teacher had said it all. He didn't need to prove anything anymore. The lesson had been taught, and it was clear integrity wasn't about fighting back. It was about standing tall, even when everyone else tried to tear you down. And that was something Malik had already learned. The weeks that followed Jack Reacher's visit to the school were a whirlwind of disbelief and shifting dynamics. The entire school had been shaken, and though the whispers had quieted, the change was permanent. Malik no longer walked through the hallways with a sense of shame or uncertainty. But the school itself had yet to fully process what had happened. There were no more loud jeers, no more open mockery. But there was something else, a kind of collective, silent hesitation. The students were still struggling to reconcile the image of the man they had seen that day with the larger-than-life character they'd known only through books and movies. Jack Reacher had entered their world, uninvited, without fanfare, and left them with a truth they weren't ready to face. In the lunchroom, the usual conversations felt awkward now. Students who had once rallied around Kyle's taunts now exchanged glances, unsure of how to interact with Malik. They had seen Reacher, stood in the same room with him, and yet the disbelief lingered. How could someone so famous, so unattainable, be real in this space? And how could Malik, of all people, be the son of such a man? Even teachers struggle with it. Malik could feel their eyes on him during lessons, some filled with curiosity, others still uncertain of how to act. Mr. Edwards, while respectful, seemed different now. There was no more sarcasm, no more offhand remarks about his father. But in the teacher's eyes, there was something else, an acknowledgement that, despite everything, Malik had been telling the truth all along. And that truth had thrown the entire school's reality into a state of confusion. Malik didn't mind the stares anymore. He had long since stopped needing the approval of his classmates. But as he moved through the hallways, he saw the shift in the school, the lingering questions in the faces of those around him. They hadn't yet fully accepted the reality of his story. But for Malik, the truth had already been proven, not by words, but by the undeniable presence of a man who had shown them all that sometimes the most powerful truths are the ones that leave you speechless. It was an ordinary afternoon when the unexpected happened, and for Malik, it felt like the world had tilted on its axis once again. The school was hosting its annual field day, a chaotic mix of games, races, and laughter. Malik had mostly kept to the sidelines, enjoying the freedom of being away from the classroom and the awkwardness of his previous encounters. But as he was walking towards the bleachers to sit with Jamal, the sound of shouting caught his attention.